Currently we're sitting in a Convair 880, kind of one of the first well-known airliners that carried people around during that boom of commercial aviation. And the cockpit that you see in front of you is a lot different in most respects from the majority of cockpits in the fleet today. However, like we mentioned earlier, some of the airplanes that are flying around come from the early 80s, late 70s, up until modern day. So there are still some cockpits that kind of resemble this that are out there. Today's a little different than it used to be. When this whole thing first started, there was usually not a door. There was maybe a curtain, and if the door was there, it usually wasn't locked. And the flight crew, once you got up in cruise and the autopilot was on, would usually go back, converse with flight attendants, get their food, get their coffee, and it was kind of like open flow. You can either go in and out of the cockpit. If the little kid wanted to come see the cockpit while you were flying, you could bring them up there. And that's kind of changed because of obvious reasons in recent years. Now the cockpit door is always locked, and we have security procedures in place to get in and out of the cockpit when we need to go to the restroom. And it's kind of a hassle, but because of recent events, it's kind of necessary. As far as coffee and food and everything like that goes, when you have a 5-leg day and you're having 30-minute turns where you get there and you get the airplane ready and do your checks and leave right away, it's kind of a necessity to have food and drink. Normally before each flight we'll get a big bottle of water just so we have something to drink, and normally before we get in we'll go get a coffee and stuff. We have cup holders, depending on the aircraft, or a little tray that you can put your food on. But yeah, I mean, once we get up in cruise, we shift from an operations role where we're really flying the aircraft, manipulating the controls, to the autopilot's on and we're kind of monitoring the aircraft. And while that's equally important, it takes a little less minute-to-minute input by the pilot on the flight controls. So that's the point that usually we take out our food, we'll eat, maybe have a newspaper, but all the while it's like 1 minute of snacking, eating, reading, and then going back and checking the flight instruments, making sure the airplane's where it's supposed to be going, making sure we don't overfly any airports or anything like that. But we do have kind of a relaxing environment once we get up in cruise. We'll talk, chat, eat, have some food, read a newspaper. So it's a pretty laid-back job once you actually get up in cruise. And if you need to go to the back to go to the bathroom, some passengers will ask, hey, where are we? What did we just fly over? And usually you're like so tired and just paying attention to waypoints on a chart that you have no idea what state you're in, sometimes what country you're in. So that question's kind of dreaded sometimes. But the communication outside the cockpit, for the most part, is pretty minimal. The exception is on international flights longer than 8 hours, you have to have a relief crew. And on those flights, the crew will take the airplane off, get it up to cruise. The relief crew will come to the front and fly the airplane in cruise, and then the initial crew that took the airplane off will come back for the landing. And that exchange occurs usually half hour into the flight and half hour, maybe an hour before landing, depending on the regulations for that airline. And in the meantime, the crew that's resting usually gets a rest bunk of some sort. Bigger airplanes, they have a dedicated crew for a crew room, where you actually get a bunk and you sleep. Some of the smaller airplanes, like the 757, you just get a row of 3 seats or a first class seat with a curtain around it that's designated for crew to sleep in and rest during that flight. But other than that, interaction pretty much stays between the two guys in the cockpit.